welcome back to the Prosperous Empath. Kat here. You know, something I chat about with clients a lot is our relationship to risk. How do we grow our capacity for risk-taking, overcoming fear, making bigger jumps in the direction of our dreams? And today's conversation with our guest feels like a beautiful example of how oftentimes in our moments, in our greatest moments of fear, we discover who we really are. I'm so honored and excited to have our guest, Lindsey Epperly, join me on the show today. Lindsey is the CEO of Jetset World Travel, which she has scaled from a one-person operation into a team of well over 80 dedicated members. Recently recognized on the Inc. 5000 list of fastest growing companies, she has been named to the Forbes Next 1000 list and was most inspired by navigating her industry's greatest crisis, the tourism industry, while expecting her first child, a season she affectionately refers to as the MBA she never wanted. Lindsey is dedicated to fighting burnout and imposter syndrome while teaching others how to turn obstacles into opportunities on her podcast, Who Made You the Boss? You will love today's conversation if you're in a journey of wanting to pursue your dreams and experiencing some obstacles or fear, or really wanting to expand your capacity to take risks, become a better leader, and you just don't know how. On the show today, we dive into Lindsey's story of scaling her travel agency while navigating the COVID-19 pandemic. We talk about her relationship with fear as an entrepreneur and how she learned to become a resilient risk taker, which I think will really resonate with you. We jump into her relationship with battling her inner critic and overcoming imposter syndrome, and really figuring out how you can stop being your own bottleneck in business. We dive into this illusion of control that we all seem to maintain as being our own bosses. How do you hire and lead a team effectively and realize that your way is not the only and best way? And we throw in a little discussion at the end about how she manages her marriage and partnership to her husband and business partner, which I think is often a topic where we all could use a little more modeling and ideas of how couples partner and wear multiple hats together do it so well. And I loved what Lindsey had to share about that. I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you're looking for an excuse to come spend some more time with yours truly, come join us for our next non-networking power hour. It's our monthly gathering for empathpreneurs to come and bring requests for meaningful support and be supported by a like-minded community of empathpreneurs. The next event is coming up on Monday, June 10th at 12 noon Eastern Time. And if you can't join us there, come join us in our online community. The link for both are in the show notes. And with that, let's dive into today's conversation. I think you're going to love it. Hello and welcome to the Prosperous Empath podcast, designed especially for empaths and highly sensitive entrepreneurs just like you who are committed to achieving holistic success. I'm your host, Catherine Wood, Master Certified Coach, author, mastermind leader, and founder of Unbounded Potential, a boutique coaching firm for empathic entrepreneurs. I'm on a mission to bring empathy back into the world of business. Each episode will focus on achieving more by doing less through leveraging empath-friendly leadership practices, boundaries, rituals, and systems, all the while continuing to care deeply about ourselves, others, and the world around us. If you are committed to joyful living and running a conscious business, but amassing wealth while doing so, proving that you can have both in a society that tells you you can't, then you are in the right place. Join me here each week to find out how. Be sure to subscribe and leave a review so you won't miss an episode. Plus, you'll find all the show notes and helpful resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Lindsey, welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Kat. I know we are going to have a really good conversation today.
I always appreciate when mutual friends connect guests with me because they're always such just like immediate connections. And I really enjoyed our first connection. And we share a lot of values and interests. So I'm excited for today's talk. By way of getting us started, I'd love to invite you to share your pronouns and a little bit about your story, because I think we all connect and learn through storytelling.
Yeah. So I am Lindsey Epperly, pronouns she, her, and I own Jetset World Travel, which is a modern travel agency. We were virtual before it became cool to be virtual in the pandemic. And I'm a mom of two littles. I have a just turned 1-year-old and soon to be 4-year-old.
Just turned 1 and just turned 4. Amazing.
It's a fun season. And I should add to boot, I am married to my business partner. So everything is a little bit blurred lines when it comes to personal and professional in my life.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure we could have an entire separate conversation around how you maintain those hats and those roles and be wife and co-parent and friend and business partner.
Yes. Yeah. It's interesting that you even think to include the word friend, because that is such an important aspect still of our identities, right? And our partnership when it comes to mine and my husband's. And it's, there are a lot of hats to be worn for sure.
Yeah, totally. Well, the place I'd love to start the conversation is maybe you could just kind of jump into the story, but this really captured my interest because your travel agency has been around since pre-COVID.
Mm-hmm.
And we all know that the travel industry was decimated during COVID, and yours is an international travel agency.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm actually not sure if I shared this with you, but my parents are innkeepers by industry. I grew up in a bed and breakfast in coastal New England.
Oh, you sound like a beautiful novel that I would like to read.
I have lots of stories. And they ran the bed and breakfast for 29 years and retired during the pandemic. And honestly, it was a welcomed, I think not in the moment, but in hindsight, a welcomed change. And you made it. You came out the other side. And so I would love to hear really how that journey unfolded for you.
Yeah. No, I didn't know that about your parents. So I know that you can understand then that the travel industry was not the world's best to be in during a global pandemic when all flights are grounded and we have no business to be doing. But it's interesting that you talk about it being kind of a welcomed situation, a welcome shift, because for me now in retrospect, mine was as well. At the time, though, and I'll kind of set the stage for everyone listening, at the time it was March of 2020. Of course, everyone knows what happened. But I was 5 months pregnant with my first little girl. My husband is my business partner. We had our home under contract that we were going to be bringing our daughter home to. And as this is happening, we're having to make the painful decision of do we keep the business or do we keep the home? And we decided to walk away from the home because we had these really grand visions for the business of, okay, we know that this industry is going to come back and we know that we want our livelihood to be around the freedom and flexibility of entrepreneurship. My husband, just the year prior when we got married, had actually left his job in finance. So of course there were conversations of, oh, should he go back and get that job in finance? Is this actually a wise decision, especially as we're bringing a baby into the world? But our guiding light and our mission was very much, we just believe in this business enough to walk away from the home, enough to make the sacrifices that we made, and to say, we believe if we stick with it, we'll be able to turn a lot of this obstacle into opportunity. And that's exactly what we did through organic growth, through an acquisition opportunity, and just kind of holding steady to the faith and something that we were building that was bigger than us.
How did you assess, how did you make that decision? I mean, I can only imagine how in personal and perhaps life connecting of a decision that would have been to walk away from the home or business. What kind of played into your decision-making process?
It's a really good question. And this is where it's really beneficial to have a business partner who operates from a totally different side of the brain than you do, right? So I am as right-brained, erratic, come up with a million ideas before noon, just that type of personality, very creative, very emotionally driven. And if it were just up to me, I probably would have made decisions as the wind was blowing one way or the other. And during that time, it was very violently blowing toward, oh gosh, just burn it all down and start over, or just become a mom. You're just going to be a mom anyway. Why not, close the shop and just do that? And On the flip side, I had my husband who is very, very methodical, very strategic, left brain. I will never forget the way that we did this from the methodical standpoint, because it's not at all how I think. But we had a spreadsheet that we would consult every day called Project Slim Fast. And it was all about, cutting the fat and making sure that we could last. And what does our run rate look like? And oh gosh, the government just released a new round of funding. So now we can last another 3 months, right? Like, it was constantly assessing. And so it was not one big decision, we're going to stick this out forever. It was a million small decisions surrounding every day that had new facts, and every day this lasted longer too, right? The longer it lasted, the more we felt like, oh, on one hand, we've been in it this long, but on the other hand, we don't have much longer to go. And so we were just always very wise watching our money and making sure that we kind of kept up with that run rate. But I'll tell you from the psychological standpoint, maybe a number of your listeners can relate to this if they're founders or just the entrepreneurial type. This business that I have will turn 10 this year. And I founded it before my husband came into it. I had founded it about 5 years prior. It was then called Epperly Travel, which is my maiden name. As we were going through the pandemic, it was still called Epperly Travel. We rebranded after we acquired a company in 2021, after we acquired Jetset World Travel. But I'm saying all of this to say that there's a real tangible situation that happens when you have founded a business and you are in relationship with that business, right? It is, for all intents and purposes, for me, it was my first baby. And I had poured my entire 20s into it, my entire heart and soul into this company that I had such a interesting dynamic with. And then we have it play this dynamic of my recent husband, as he's entered into the picture a year prior. And he's saying, well, what if we were to do this with it? What if we were to do this? And I'm like, no, this is mine to make decisions around, right? There's this like real toxic founder syndrome that was happening. And so as I'm making these decisions with my husband, I'm also making these decisions for what felt like almost like a living, breathing part of the family, the business that you founded.
Yeah. I mean, our businesses, they have their own energy. Like, they have a relationship. We have a relationship to them. And as we evolve, both as people and the leadership in the company, our relationships to the business have to evolve also. So I know you love talking about imposter syndrome, and I'm excited to go there. And before we do, actually, I want to talk about fear, because I've been coaching for about a decade as well. And over the years, the client that I've most kind of been attracted to has shifted and evolved. And I love working with entrepreneurs because of the entrepreneur's relationship to fear and their willingness to embrace fear, to lean into change, to lean into that necessity to pivot and reinvent. And you were kind of given like a whole smorgasbord of conditions to really require you to face fear at a really high speed and velocity, which I think is just really impressive. Like, I'm pregnant with my first now, and I certainly have fear about my business, but you as the breadwinner, having just gone into business with your husband, you have one sole income, expecting a first, buying a house. Like,
all the things.
How have you embraced your relationship to fear over your entrepreneurial journey? How has it shifted? Like, I'd really love for you to maybe share a little bit about that.
Yeah, Kat, this is why we hit it off so well when we first spoke, because you asked such thoughtful questions. And this is, you're right. It's such an intrinsic part of the entrepreneurial journey to know about your fear. And to be honest, up until that point, I hadn't really thought about it, because everything I had always done had succeeded, and it was all up and to the right. And so I was just constantly used to an upward trajectory. And I remember when this happened, it wasn't even fear that I recognized. It was that I finally understood the dark side of risk, right? That always I had gotten reward, and, oh, this is what they mean when they talk about being fearful. And as an entrepreneur, this is what they mean by risk, right? Like, we are set to and will lose it all, depending on where the cards fall in this situation. And what was interesting was, at the time, I lived in a lot of fear. I mean, it really, when I talk about myself being kind of emotional and an emotional decision maker, a lot of that is fear-based, because especially becoming a mom too, right? I think there's this kind of like biological thing happening where you just want to choose the safe bet and you just want to be taken care of. And you want to, of course, make sure you have a roof over your head. Like everything in you is driving toward protect this baby, even at just that time, 5 months pregnant. And so there were a lot of interesting things going on that were really, really lighting up the fear card in my mind. And I knew our situation. I knew we were not going to go destitute. We have a wonderful family that we were always going to be able to fall back on. But there was always this level of like, I don't want to have to do that, right? Like I want to, as an entrepreneur, I've always wanted to prove myself and my ambitions I've always chased after so wholeheartedly that when this all happened, it felt like I was the failure, not just that the business was failing. And so I really had to learn to unlink that self-esteem and self-worth. But going back to the original concept of fear, I had it so gravely during that time. And what has wound up happening to me on the other side of this is being able to look back and say, oh, wow, that all worked out in ways that I couldn't have even imagined better for myself than it would have had status quo continued happening or had I given into that fear. And so I would say what it has done for me, especially as an entrepreneur, has enabled me to become an even greater risk taker because we have been to the bottom. We have seen what that is like and we were able to survive. And so now we have a track record and that helps to fight against fear.
I mean, I think that we all know that to be true, that we all know that hindsight is so meaningful and that our capacity to overcome and to lean into fear, like it helps us build that resiliency muscle after the fact.
After the fact.
But in that moment, like in that moment of really needing to either kind of lean in or jump ship, I guess I'm just curious, like if there are practices or habits that you strengthened during that time that really helped strengthen your resolve and your willingness to lean in?
Yes. Yes. There is one pivotal question that I recommend to anyone going through a similar season of life. And I actually learned it from, I'm a Christian by faith, and I attended church with a pastor named Andy Stanley. And Andy posed the question one morning of, what story do you want to tell when you're in a time of crisis? And if there's any practice that is better than the rest, it was being able to answer that question, right? It was constantly asking myself, what story do I want to tell? Do I want to tell the story that this is what decimated my business and I accepted it? Do I want to tell the story that this is where it ended and I then decided to go after the life that I wasn't really as excited about without this business aspect of it, right? Like I didn't want to tell those stories. For me, everyone has a different story they want to tell, but for me, I wanted to tell the story of we held steady, we remained faithful, we held on to hope in spite of the outcome, and we did right by our industry and by our teammates. We kept everyone employed, we kept the lights on, we really put out a lot of great leadership and great content into the industry at the time. That was all the stuff that helped me get through, was being able to answer that one question, what story do you want to tell? And from each of those aspects were how we got opportunities, right? The opportunity to acquire even came from one of the initiatives that we put out into the world because I wanted to tell the story that we were a light in a dark time.
Oh, I really love that. I really hear perhaps your connection to your purpose, the connection to the purpose in the industry and the role that you wanted to play. I've actually been thinking about purpose a lot lately, doing some work around it. And a quote comes to mind by Carl Jung. And I'm actually going to pull it up because I don't want to screw it up. It's so good. Yeah, Carl Jung said, living without purpose is one of the most grievous wounds to our soul.
Yeah.
And we all experience dark nights of the soul. And it's really in that darkness that we get to discover who we are and what we stand for and what we believe. And I think that is the journey of the entrepreneur that thrives, right? Is they really have to reconnect and recommit to their purpose.
Yes. Yeah. You know, one of the things that kept me going the most was I had never had a greater opportunity to step up as a leader. And I felt a really strong mission and purpose driving me toward that of looking around and realizing there was not a lot of examples of great leadership in my industry at the time. There was a lot of quietness, honestly, a lot of silence, a lot of insecurity that was breeding from that. And I felt like, well, here is a chance that I can step into what I feel like is my purpose and then give other people a purpose as well, a place to come to exercise that purpose. And that was so much of how we grew during that time. So I completely agree. It was that shared mission that we were able to kind of set everyone marching orders toward that gave us all a reason to continue doing what we were doing, which as travel advisors was simply canceling and postponing a lot. So the actions did not feel at all in alignment with what our job description should be or what we wanted to be doing. But we knew we're marching towards something greater, and it was that purpose.
Do you think you were connected with your purpose at the time? Like, were you clear on that, on what you were standing for?
Well, yes and no in some ways. It was interesting because I feel like I knew it for the business, but I don't know if I knew it for myself. In the hindsight, I know it more for myself, but for the business, I knew with absolute clarity. And I actually very early on, I want to say like last week of March, was able to set an intention and a mission for our team for as long as this thing would last. And that mission was to be a beacon during the industry's darkest hour. And so that was crystal clear to me. This is our purpose. And when I would show up to work, I would show up going toward that mission. Just, I know that this is what we are made for. We, as what was Epperly Travel at the time, what is now Jetset World Travel, that was what we were there for. For me personally, I think a lot of the stuff I was doing behind the scenes was the work of figuring that out. And to be honest, I have always wanted to write. I have always wanted to communicate, which I do in my business all the time, but I wanted to do it for a larger appeal. And this is one of the reasons I even launched a podcast this year, right? Like all of this came from me working to discover my own soul's purpose that was really ignited during a time of COVID. And it was so helpful because for all these different reasons, my husband stepped in and really started leading the company in a way that I was not able to, because physically with pregnancy, it was taking a toll on my body. And so I was able to actually carve out some time and space more than usual and start leaning into, oh, this is what I'm crafted to do. I started making content. I started writing again. I started laying the groundwork for a podcast, like all of these things that I knew were my calling as well.
I'm hearing just so many connections here. I think that there's some real overlap between when we're super connected with our purpose. It creates an easier invitation for others to join us and support us under a shared mission and vision. And I'm also curious about the overlap that being connected with your purpose and the company's purpose has for you in relationship to imposter syndrome. Because I think there's a real overlap in how we can overcome and be in deeper relationship with our own inner critics, which we all have, when we're really clear on what we stand for.
Yes. Gosh, I love this subject, as you know. I mean, I created a whole podcast called Who Made You the Boss? Because I have so often asked myself that question when looking in the mirror as an entrepreneur. But coming from the luxury travel industry, which I did not grow up in any sort of luxury world, or, the nicest thing I ever stayed in was a Sheraton, which is still very nice. But like, then I enter into this luxury travel industry that's like opulence all over, right? It's all about 5-star hotels and experiences. And I remember even I was 19 when I first entered into it. That was where I first recognized imposter syndrome, was like, who are you to plan someone's luxury vacation, right? Like you don't even know what fork to use at dinner when you're at a dinner party. I mean, all these things that I didn't know that the inner critic would start working on. And I was able to kind of plow through that because I loved the action of the sale and I loved how I was serving clients, and all of these things overpowered the inner critic. But I always falsely believed that inner critic would go away with the more success and or the higher the ranks, right? When I became a mentor, when I became a CEO, as the business owner, et cetera, et cetera. And I found that imposter syndrome just keeps churning in the background, no matter what role and no matter how much you succeed. And if anything, it gets a bit stronger as you go up in the rungs, because it's a lonelier experience oftentimes, right? Like as you are climbing in leadership, you are one of one in that organization. And that can really be a breeding ground for that little nagging voice to say, hey, are you sure you should be the one that's doing this? And I wanted to start talking about that. I wanted to talk about that with really amazing, prolific individuals who I've been able to interview with the podcast. And then I also wanted to talk about my own journey, because I just actually feel countercultural to the idea of like silence that inner critic and just move forward. I actually think we should embrace the fact that it's there because it means you're doing something outside of your comfort zone. It's actually a good thing. Like if you were not doing this a little bit right, then you probably would not have a little bit of imposter syndrome, right? So I do actually think it's kind of a harbinger of something better to come. And I appreciate that of it.
Yeah, I think there's a distinction I often use in my work called name and normalize, right? Like when we can name the ways of being or those like fear mongers that we need to put at bay, like it can help us normalize them. And I actually really appreciate what you just said because my husband and I are putting an offer down on a home later today or tomorrow morning. And it's been a journey, as home buying often is. And something I'm just really connecting the dots for myself is that I was really scared about the house at first. My husband was all in. Yes, this is the house. I can see us here. And I was like, I'm not sure. I don't know. And I actually think it was a little bit of my own imposter syndrome, like allowing myself that caliber of a home, that standard of living, that quality of life, which is really beautiful and worthy of me and definitely outside of my comfort zone.
Yes. Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? That it can just rear its ugly head in any and all scenarios.
And like sometimes we just really need to name it to normalize it.
Yes. Yeah. I love that you practice that. There's a great book that recently came out and I just interviewed the author. Her name is Amy Schoenthal and the book is called The Setback Cycle. And she has an entire chapter about naming your inner critic, which I've heard people do before, but she just does a really beautiful job of like actually visualizing hers, right? Like it was based off of a neighbor's mom and it's got a specific name and this is her accent and this is how she shows up. And I just thought that was so good to almost personify it. And that way it's just another seat at the table when it comes to our emotions and what is present.
Totally. And I really appreciate the reminder that, when our inner critic, when imposter syndrome shows up, it is a sign that we're stretching and growing. It is a sign that we're actually declaring beyond the bounds of our comfort zone.
Yes. Yeah.
It's not a bad thing. It's actually a sign of growth. It's an indicator of our potential.
Yeah. Exactly. It does not mean you have to listen to all of the lies it's telling you, but it doesn't also mean that the thing we should do is just ignore it and move on. It's actually, let's acknowledge it. Let's actually appreciate the fact that we're putting ourselves out there and doing something important and keep going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. So I think I was reading that your company has 70 employees. Is that correct?
So I think we are actually above 90 at this point. I probably need to update the bio. We're a team of both employees and independent contractors. And so our independent contractor arm is growing thoughtfully, but quickly. So that is probably why we have a different number.
Okay. So the reason I ask is because in my experience, imposter syndrome shows up a lot in leadership and supervision.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, and particularly for empathpreneurs and sensitives who are so responsible for our energy and the kind of the vibe we give off, right? We're often much more critical of ourselves and how people perceive us. How has imposter syndrome played a role in your leadership? And how have you transformed it, or what have you learned from it over the years?
Yeah. Empathpreneurs. I like that a lot. So I'll tell you, something about it is the culture of Jetset is so professional and personal development based. And I like to really look at our team members holistically. And so that's why we're constantly pouring into one another. And I'm very much the leader that's saying, hey, I've dealt with this and I've felt this and I feel this presently. So when it comes to imposter syndrome, it's allowed me to kind of step up and be more authentic. Again, it's why I released a whole podcast about it, because we talk about it so often that I thought maybe other people outside of the industry even would want to hear about this too. But when it comes to kind of protecting that energy, something that I've learned recently that, I don't know, maybe everyone knew this but me, but it's the difference between being a good leader and being a good manager, and that you don't have to be both. And what I mean by that is I always assumed the managing of people was also synonymous with leadership. And so I would beat myself up a lot because I felt like I got some really good nods toward leadership, but man, the managing of people is just not my natural forte. And it wasn't until last year when my husband and I were like 8 hours in on an HR thing. And we looked at each other and we're like, neither of us are equipped to handle this HR thing. Like, why is this that the business owner is, especially of a small to mid-sized business, that's often one of the last things we even think to outsource, because we almost feel like, well, outsourcing management means we no longer care. And it's actually quite the opposite. It's that we care so much that we don't want to get it wrong. And why are we the ones that are judge and jury on this situation? We are actually biased because we're involved in the business, right? So I remember realizing that those are two different things, that I can still pursue being a good leader and excel as a leader and tap in others who are really good managers to help manage the actual kind of people things and the team side of that is, I think, very different from leadership. And so that's one way that we've been able to kind of reconcile it. I would say just a lesson I recently learned.
Yeah, I mean, I think through the lens of taming our inner critic, I hear perhaps releasing that expectation or that pressure that you need to do it all,
Yes.
that you need to be the one to hold all the hats or manage all the balls. And that in reality, in staying in your own lane, you can do in a more effective role.
Yes. Yeah. And to be honest, this is maybe going to just be my constant life's reiteration of having to learn that lesson, that I, for so long, was the bottleneck of everything. And I think many entrepreneurs can relate to this, especially if you go from solopreneur, being the lead practitioner, to now building out a company around that service. And you have to make those active decisions of, do I stay lead salesperson, or do I serve the company better by growing into a leadership role and appointing others, right? Like, it's just a constant art of delegation. And I remember my business mentor, saying to me at the very end of 2019 that the tighter you cling, the slower you'll grow. And of course, at the time, I thought, well, that's a lovely sentiment. I should let go of control a little bit, and then life completely made me let go of control. So you're right. It's instead of assuming and expecting of ourselves that we wear all the hats and do all the tasks and that no one's going to do it like us and all of that, right? It's learning the areas where we can actually acknowledge that we don't have to be the one that is doing that. And there are people that are actually really great at it who will excel in that role if we give them the autonomy to do so.
I'm curious about this idea of acknowledging, owning, and releasing being the bottleneck in business. From my vantage point, a lot of that is so much inner work and disentangling our self-esteem from our self-worth, and realizing that it doesn't have to be all about us, that it's not our job. So I guess I'm curious to maybe hear a little bit more about, how did you release the bottleneck that was you?
Yeah, it is a lot of self-work. You are right. And a lot of that was tied to what I thought was success. Then I thought that was my self-confidence and my self-worth. And it was all too intermingled. Here's a quick, tangible thing that helped me a lot. And I guess maybe like listeners could like write this down and implement this today if wanted, right? It was simply learning to delegate the what instead of the how. And so for me, the reason I was the bottleneck is because I wanted everyone to do it exactly like I would do it. Whenever I would delegate an action or an item that needed to get done, it was always then, and this is how you should do it because this is how I would do it. And I realized like that is one of the reasons that everyone's having to come to me and ask permission. And this is why my inbox is getting clogged and they're all waiting on me to sign off on it. And my husband was actually the one who pointed this out, lovingly so, and saying, what if someone actually had their own how they were able to do it in their own way because they are uniquely equipped to do this job, but it still delivered the results that you wanted. And so we can set up kind of like accountability, checks and balances in between. But as soon as you tell them what you need done, get out of the way from the how. Let them figure out the how. And that has been, game changing for me.
Mm-hmm. I also think it requires a willingness to check your own ego, and that your way is the right way or the best way or the perfect way.
Yes. As an only child and single female business founder, when I founded my business, I would say that I believed my way was the only way, right? Like there was only one right way and it was mine. And now building up a leadership team, going into business with my husband, I'm so glad to not buy into that misconception anymore, because I really see the beauty and the value in how many different brains we have and how many different skill sets we have that are coming to the table. And of course, my way is not the only and best way.
You've brought up your husband now a couple times, and we talk about relationships a lot on the podcast because we have a relationship to everything and everyone in our lives, right? And so I guess I'm just curious, from the lens of kind of redefining success and reinvention, how do you and your husband perhaps manage the many hats that you both play in your life, and how do you make it all work? Because it sounds like it works really beautifully.
Yeah, it sounds like that because of how long it did not work beautifully. So don't don't let me give you the wrong impression. It took a long time to get here. Now that we are here, it does, because it serves our family really, really well. But I'll tell you some of the mistakes we made early on in case this helps, frame what we do now. But essentially, anytime someone talks about going into business with their partner, one of the first pieces of advice either Jeremy or I would give to them is to make sure you really cultivate professional respect for each other. And this feels like it should be a no-brainer, right? You love this human. You have given your whole life to this human. You are partners in life. It does not naturally translate to loving the work version of that person, because we all have to admit, like, I show up to work as a bit of a different person than I do as a mom or as a wife at home. There's a reason that the business has been successful, and it's because I have a certain level of headstrong willpower that just kind of keeps me going. And I am not quite that aggressive at home. And so when we think about this, my work version showed up and my husband, Jeremy's work version showed up. And these two people were not desperately in love like they are at home. Like, these two people actually did not get along all that well to begin with. And so we had to realize, well, and we over communicate. So that is my number one tip for working with your partner. We over communicate everything. And we recognize this tension, and we just couldn't figure out, like, why is there such a tug and pull, and why doesn't he want to do it my way? And why don't I want to do it his way? And why, and we realized we were not actually giving one another that professional respect. I wasn't coming to the table and saying, oh, well, I appreciate the way that he thinks, right? This is the one right way type of thinking. And he wasn't coming to the table and saying, oh, wow, she's built this whole business based off of the way that she thinks, right? Like, we were both just very set in our ways. And so learning that, and really what it boils down to is learning and identifying our lanes and then being able to maintain them, because we trust the other person to get it done, in their unique skill set and ability. So, but that did not come as naturally as I think people assume it would, given you're with your partner pretty frequently and you think you know that person.
Well, honestly, I think that's the reason I asked the question, because I think that anytime there is such effective partnership, it is a sign of the work that's been put in. And a couple of the nuggets that I hear in what you've shared is, first, the reminder to expect and welcome the best, right? Like, having positive regard for one another, like really leaving perhaps your previous attachments or stories about how your partner is or communicates or acts, or, finishes or doesn't finish his tasks or follow through on his word, right? Like, really checking your baggage. And then the second piece, which you kind of glazed over, but I'd love to dig in a little deeper on the second piece, is over communicating.
Yes.
Because, and specifically for my audience, like, I think this is so important. Empaths, like, we're typically over givers and under communicators, like learning how to articulate, communicate, stand for, be generous, but boundaried around getting our needs met is a practice. It is a practice over a perfect. I come from a family that is very conflict avoidant. Like, I didn't learn to over communicate. I didn't even learn to perhaps articulate, my upset or my needs or my hurt feelings. And so all of that, I had to acquire the skill set. And my husband comes from a very pro-conflict family. So we really needed to learn how to over communicate in a way that allowed both of us to hear the other party. And I think that is a real super skill that many empathpreneurs, they really need to work at in their partnerships. Like, Over communicating, yes. And ensuring that what you intend to communicate is what is heard and understood.
Yes. Gosh, yeah, Kat. I come from the background of um, we all should have the same opinion, right? Like if we have differing opinions, then you're wrong. And so I completely
I hear you.
yes. And so you're right. Like the one that was all learning to respect other viewpoints and actually embrace and realize this company is going to be better off because of it. But also our household is, right? Like the over communicating thing. I think this is applicable whether you work with your spouse or just you simply live in a home with another person, right? Like because we work from home too, we would oftentimes find ourselves interrupting one another's days, and nothing would drive each of us crazier than that happening. I would come like into the basement and say, oh, I need to talk about this one thing. And then this one thing would be like a 30-minute conversation. And Jeremy's like, well, there goes the time that I allotted for emails. Like we're both very boundaried with our time. And we've learned, actually, we have a standing coffee date where we just parking lot those types of conversations and ideas so that we are able to carve out the time to over communicate around the topics that we know we need to give that space to, but it's not done in a way that's like totally derailing our partner getting their work done. So if anyone works from home with your partner, whether you guys work together or not, that has been a probably marriage saver for us to just have that intentional time for all the topics, whether it's personal or professional.
I mean, and I think that's such a brilliant practice, especially for high achievers, because we often have this like necessity to get things handled now, right? To get the answer I need right now, to figure it out right now so we can move forward. So that just that having that willingness to park this conversation, park this conflict, park this topic, it requires perhaps an internal deepening of patience and willingness to put something down.
Yes. Well, and when you talk about self-work, that is definitely something that I have had to work on myself. That I just used to operate like everything was on fire always. And so now being in partnership personally and professionally, and now leading a team, I really have started assessing, does that need to be done yesterday? Or could we give that some space and time? And that's an important part of delegating too, right? Like my task can't come before every single other person's on the team. I have to really be thoughtful about, well, it's okay if it gets done by the end of the week. That's not going to be the end of the world just because I would get it done by yesterday, So that patience practice will probably also be one that I'm constantly learning.
Yeah, totally. I mean, absolutely. I mean, I'm thinking about motherhood and patience. That's obviously a place I will look forward to practicing.
Yeah. Careful what you wish for.
Well, yeah. Noted. Well, I'm mindful of the time, and I guess I just want to perhaps put the ball in your court and see if there's anything that I haven't yet asked you or that we haven't yet explored that you really feel called to share or that you want to maybe expand on.
That's a good question. I feel like you've touched on a lot of the things that I am obsessed with thinking about because you are an empathpreneur. And it's so helpful to have a conversation with someone else who feels all the feelings in their business, because I think a lot of times we're taught to keep those two things separate. And I'll tell you, maybe just like to that note, one of the stories that I like to tell, I've shared this recently on my podcast of talking about like the traditional way we view business and how I once had a number of male mentors who were fabulous mentors. But one of the things they would always tell me when I was kind of feeling extra emotional about, a client situation or the growth of the business or something early on in my career, I remember they would always say, well, you just got to get thicker skin. Like that, this was like unanimous across the board, the advice that I received, as though I could just go purchase thicker skin from like Office Depot. And every time I would try, I thought, well, the way I get thicker skin is by continuing to callous, by inserting myself back into that situation that makes me very worn down and exhausted. And I just spent so many years like that until I started realizing, like, wait a minute, actually, this thing that I thought was thin skin, this thing that is actually my body telling me, hey, you should move on and evolve from that particular task. Like you are not meant to stay and callous. You are meant to give that to someone else who might be more equipped to do it. And that's honestly a big thing that I've learned with my entire partnership and now with the leadership team is oftentimes I think we misunderstand our own empathic ways and our own intuition as something that modern business and modern society will tell us, like, just ignore it, just get thicker skin, just build up around it. And actually, it's a superpower. And so I love what you're doing on this show because it is talking to individuals who still want to pursue their ambitions and still want to be in the world of business, but also don't want to glaze over how we're uniquely wired. So I really appreciate the work that you're doing.
I mean, I really love that we're ending on that note because that is entirely why I launched this podcast, because I think that there is a marketplace for empathpreneurs in the business world. There is an opportunity to do things differently, and it requires having models of successful entrepreneurs who are empathic and highly sensitive and highly sensory, and seeing versions and frameworks for how you can do business differently, for how you can do business in alignment with your values that are the full expression of who you are versus what you just traditionally see in the business world, what you're still seeing on media and seeing in the business books and the business books that are authored by these, traditional white male figures. Like, we really need models who are doing it our way. And so I'm so glad that you put that in, and I'm so glad that you didn't develop that thicker skin.
Thank you, Kat. Thank you for setting the way. I mean, a show like this is exactly what gives me hope and inspiration. So I appreciate the work that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, when we end, I always ask all my guests, what's most supported you in becoming a prosperous empath?
What has most supported me in becoming a prosperous empath? Gosh, if I hadn't just shared that story, that's probably the one I would share. And that leaning into what I actually thought was a weakness has allowed us to, this company has grown more in 4 years than I ever even imagined it could grow, right? We landed on the Inc. 5000 list last year because I learned what it meant to give up the illusion of control and to trust others and lean into building and scaling a beautiful company that I have a lot of respect for because it is its own living, breathing organization outside of me. And so separating myself from the company's success, all of that, leaning into that superpower of what I thought was thin skin is what I would say has supported me the most.
Well, cheers to that. Lindsey, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's such a delight being with you.
Thanks, Kat.
Thank you so much for listening today to this episode of the Prosperous Empath Podcast with me, Catherine Wood. Make sure you subscribe and leave a review so you don't miss an episode, and so more empaths just like you and me can find the show. As a thank you, each month, one lucky reviewer will receive a 60-minute coaching session with a member of our Unbounded Potential team. You can find all the show notes and bonus resources over at unbounded-potential.com. Thank you so much for listening and locking arms with me to bring empathy and prosperity back into the world of business.